for joining us this evening for our webinar, The Ocean is Our Climate Superhero. My name is Kaitlyn Lowder, and I'm a member of our advisory council here at Stay Cool. Well, I'm fortunate enough to be moderating this webinar. I'd like to express a great amount of appreciation to the other members of the Stay Cool team who have helped this happen, especially Laura Schumacher, Linda Pratt, Sarah Benson, and the whole support of the advisory council. As many of you know, the mission of Stay Cool is to speak for those who are too young to have a voice regarding climate policies, children and grandchildren. So Stay Cool provides educational and highlights advocacy opportunities, which harnesses the power and influence of elders for action on climate change issues in the San Diego region. Our science education program is focused on the oceans, and for a really good reason, because the ocean truly is a superhero. As a marine biologist, nothing makes me happier than seeing it spit out a cool piece of algae along the shoreline or enjoying a morning snorkel along the Hoya shores. And those of us here along the coast in San Diego probably all appreciate the ocean's scenic views, its cooling breezes, and the blue economy opportunities it brings to our region as well. But it also does a tremendous service for us in the form of climate regulation by taking up about a third of the CO2 we produce since the Industrial Revolution, and storing more than 90% of the extra thermal energy in the Earth system. And so increasingly, as we're contemplating ways to continue to reduce emissions and get to negative emissions, we're discovering that there are a number of opportunities to work with the ocean to reach those goals. So to share a little bit of that breadth of opportunity, we're fortunate to be joined by 3 speakers tonight. First is Paula Sylvia from the Port of San Diego. Also, we are joined by Rhetta deMesa from the California Energy Commission and Julie Mai from CalWave. So we aim to have about 20 minutes or so of questions and discussion after the 3 presentations tonight. So if you have any questions during those presentations, add them to the chat, and then we'll circle back to those at the end. So with that, I'm really happy to introduce our first speaker for tonight, Paula Sylvia. Paula is the program director of the Aquaculture and Blue Technology program at the Port of San Diego, a program that was created in 2015. She oversees a variety of planning and pre-development initiatives aimed at developing environmental and economic opportunities for aquaculture, blue technology, and other nature-based solution businesses in and around San Diego Bay. She also manages the Port's Blue Economy Incubator, a platform to support entrepreneurship and innovation partnerships to facilitate and scale pilot projects and build a portfolio of nature-based solutions and new businesses that can deliver multiple social, environmental, and economic benefits to our region. Before coming to the Port, Paula worked as a research biologist for NOAA, the National Marine Fisheries Service, here at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center for 2.5 years. Prior to that position, she worked as the Offshore Aquaculture Program Manager at Hub SeaWorld Research Institute, also here in San Diego. In these roles, Paula was responsible for planning, permitting, and implementing offshore aquaculture projects in the Southern California region and Northern Baja California, Mexico, for fisheries replenishment, restoration, and food production purposes. So with such a wealth of experience here in San Diego, we're really looking forward to hearing from you, Paula. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. Thank you for allowing me to present. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully that goes smoothly. Give me just one sec. So everything looks good on the screen? Kaitlyn?
Looks perfect.
Great. Thank you, Kaitlyn, for the intro and for the invite to come here. I'm super happy to participate and nice to meet you all virtually. And happy to answer any questions when the time comes. So yeah, so I am just here representing some of the Port of San Diego's Blue Economy initiatives, specifically as they relate to a new program that was developed at the port called the Aquaculture and Blue Technology Program. So I'll just walk you through, basically a little bit of background on the port if you're not familiar with the port. The Port of San Diego was created back in the 60s by the State Lands Commission, well, the legislature, but basically the California State Lands Commission granted lands in and around San Diego Bay to the Port of San Diego for management of land and water uses. So we currently manage about a little over 14,000 acres of land and water for the benefit of the public, with a mission to really support commerce, navigation, fisheries, tourism, and environmental stewardship. So this map shows basically our jurisdiction in orange and the blues. It's San Diego Bay is surrounded by 5 cities: Coronado, San Diego, National City, Imperial Beach, and Chula Vista. So representatives from all of those cities actually sit on our board of port commissioners that govern all of the work that we do at the port. So, so part of that, the unique role of ports as catalysts for the blue economy, right? It's very recognized that ports play a big role in catalyzing the blue economy, just in the basic pieces of their expertise or in permitting and entitlement for a variety of different coastal and ocean uses. Our role as landlord, operator, regulator, and environmental steward. So we wear many hats. We're traditionally champions of the blue economy and supporting new business opportunities, as well as traditional blue economy businesses. And we are, bread and butter is really supporting public and public-private partnerships. So here's just a slide showing on the top part of the slide, it really shows the traditional blue economy businesses that the port has been supporting since its inception. So everything from shipbuilding and boatyards to military, commercial and recreational fishing, and now new cargo and cruise and coastal development work. But really this new emerging industries, specifically aquaculture and blue tech, bioremediation technologies are really new opportunities that the port's been looking at through my program, but also other programs at the other complementary programs at the port to really look at new ways to create environmental and economic opportunities and diversify the port's portfolio of businesses. So to that end, as Kaitlyn described, the port created the Aquaculture and Blue Tech program almost 7 years ago to look at economic and environmental opportunities in both of those spaces. Underneath the program, we developed what we call the Blue Economy Business Incubator, which really allows the port to partner with early stage companies in the aquaculture and blue technology space and primarily facilitate pilot projects. So we offer things like subject matter expertise, permit ready infrastructure that we can lease to companies to execute, to deploy their pilot projects, help in deploying the pilot projects, market access and communication informations, and in almost all cases, funding. And the idea is that companies enter into agreements with us that create an opportunity for us to invest in a new company, for that company to ideally have a successful pilot that goes through commercialization process, it scales. We get a return on our investment with a little bit of an upside so we can invest in new technologies and new pilots. So to date, we have 9 projects in our incubator portfolio. They span, aquaculture, so shellfish and seaweed aquaculture projects. There's a number of remediation projects from soil and sediment, legacy contamination kind of, issues that we have in the bay that those projects are addressing. And then things like, technology projects like, smart marina apps for helping, optimize marina latent mooring spaces in marinas, and also, creating stormwater management solutions through, 5-in-1 field testing sensor devices like the ones described by Fred Sense. I'm going to walk through, actually, before we get there. So to date, 9 pilot projects. The port has spent, 1.6 million in funding and investment with these projects, and supported all of the activities that, from permitting to execution to allow those pilots to be deployed. So I'm going to walk through just a couple in the interest of time, but at the end of my slides, there'll be a link and a QR code and to access basically we do a Blue Economy Incubator highlights report, usually annually or at the end of certain permitting cycles and project cycles, that highlights that, sort of the progress of all our projects and their positive impacts on environment, social, and financial returns. So the first one we'll just touch on is a company called ecoSPEARS. The SPEARS stands for Sorbent Polymer Extraction and Remediation System, where there's basically like a sorbent inside SPEARS that gets sunken into the contaminated sediments, where the sorbent inside the spears is passively attracting, contaminants, and in this case, PCBs. So we deployed a series of these spears on mats in a few locations around San Diego Bay that were, traditionally or do have legacy PCB pollution issues. The project is a 2-year pilot project where it's supposed to end at the end of this year, where the spears will be retrieved. And we'll get to be looking at data and results, hopefully sometime early next year, to see, how the spears performed and opportunities for expansion. The next is a company called Sunken Seaweed, which is demonstrating really seaweed aquaculture for a number of different purposes, using a site, an underwater seaweed farm at the site of our Grape Street Pier right downtown. So what you see in the middle picture is 6 buoys. Underneath those buoys is a rope and line system that basically grows seaweeds that the company produced. So they tested 6 different types of seaweeds, from kelp to other culinary seaweeds like the one in the photo, the green ulva seaweed, for culinary and then bioremediation purposes. So they developed a hatchery at San Diego State University's Marine Lab, which is just up the street from the port, and the site at Grape Street, where they basically produced babies of all these different seaweeds. We stocked them at the farm, and they've studied sort of growth and remediation characteristics and market research at the end of that. So very successful pilot, set to scale as soon as we create opportunities for that in and around San Diego Bay. The third one I'm going to focus on is a company called eConcrete. It's basically a company out of Israel that developed a unique mix of concrete, which allows basically, biodiversity and, habitat enhancement capabilities on structures that still maintain the structural integrity of, in our case, riprap along the armored shoreline. So, really creating an alternative, more nature-based like solution for green, for armoring shorelines, creating habitat value while still maintaining the structural integrity of that. So in this case, they created a tide pool called the Coastal Lock Tide Pool, which is in these photos. They're kind of interlocking tide pool systems that replaced riprap. And then over a 2-year period, they're looking at, the different ways that those tide pools are performing in terms of habitat and biodiversity enhancement, but also structural integrity. So these are photos that were taken, at 8 months post-deployment and 14 months post-deployment. And it's pretty obvious that you can see the diversity. There's over 50 different species that have taken up home there, from, little coralline algae to all these types of invertebrates like, lobsters and crabs and sea slugs and things like that. So the company is still doing a few more monitoring events, and we hope to issue reports on them in the near future. And the last couple of slides, building outside of the incubator, we're trying to build a profile of nature-based solutions at the port. So some of those companies include, companies that are in our incubator like eConcrete, Sunken Seaweed, and a few others. But there's also initiatives to support other coastal resiliency efforts that aren't specifically going through the incubator. So things like a native living shoreline, and then also creating a mitigation bank. So we're doing this with a variety of partners. This is actually an old salt pond in the South Bay called Pond 20. That's actually undergoing all the permitting and entitlements required to restore over 90 acres of basically a habitat that has no habitat value at the moment into a wetlands, and create a mitigation bank for that opportunity. So that's hopefully going to break ground in a year or two, pending permits. The other one is we just installed the Chula Vista Native Oyster Living Shorelines project, which there was a series of these reef balls that were placed at locations in the South Bay at depth, specifically to attract native Olympia oysters to that habitat. So we just installed that, and that's going to be monitored over the next few years as well. So we're super excited about that. And then lastly, like I said, the incubator can be found online or through this QR code to just kind of get a review of all the companies in our incubator and how they're currently doing. And we hope that by the next time we have a new report out, we'll have more companies added to our portfolio. So that's it. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present to you all tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. That was really wonderful to see all of the breadth of initiatives that are going on in the port during the Q&A. I would love to hear if you can go like check out any of them. Love to see all those lobsters hanging out.
They're not, you can actually see that e-concrete installation from the shore of Harbor Island Park. So, and you can actually walk down the riprap and just go and play in the tide pools if you want. So, and all that information is in the report, but it's not everything is easy to see because a lot of the projects are underwater, but you can see that one really well. So I'll stop sharing to allow time for the next folks. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. If you have any questions for Paula, feel free to add those in the chat. I'll make sure to circle back to them after our next two presentations. For our next talk, we're really excited to go a little bit further offshore with CalWave. We're glad to be joined by Julie here, who serves as the head of communications for CalWave and has been leading the company's communications and public relations strategy since 2020. Her work is centered around amplifying the importance and value of CalWave's technology in conversations around clean energy innovation and climate change. Julie comes from a social impact and business background, having spent the last decade learning and helping social entrepreneurs tackle the world's most urgent challenges, from education, health, and public safety to poverty alleviation. Julie also consults for other stakeholders within the sustainability ecosystem, such as Invested in Climate, to bridge the gaps between innovation, investment, and advocacy for climate action. She holds an MBA with concentrations in managerial leadership and social responsibility and sustainable enterprises from the University of San Diego. I'll turn it over to you, Julie.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kaitlyn, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I just want to start by thanking you all again for really advocating for our youth and, you know, the future. It gives me just more hope than I already do being able to present in groups like this. So very inspired to be here as well. And then with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. So are you seeing this okay?
For me, not yet. I see, I think the top of your screen, perhaps.
I want to unshare and try one more time. It looks like we're just seeing the very top of your screen.
Strange. Okay, let me try again.
Looks great.
Good. Okay, awesome. Okay, well, I'm really excited to be here to share our work with you and provide insights on how we're working with the ocean to tackle climate change and the energy crisis that we're facing today. And so to just dive right in, CalWave is a California-based wave energy developer that was founded out of UC Berkeley by a brilliant team of engineers, one who's actually on this call. And so our mission is to provide reliable, cost-effective ocean wave technologies for sustainable energy access. And we really see a future where we can unlock the power of ocean waves to secure a clean energy future. And so living in California, we all know how powerful and enormous and beautiful the ocean is. And so what we're really doing is tapping into this power as a sustainable and clean energy source. And so wave power really serves as a perfect complement to other renewables, as it's more consistent, more predictable, and 20 to 60 times more energy dense as well. It's available day and night throughout the season. So it's there when the sun isn't shining, when the wind isn't blowing. And compared to solar and wind, which peak in the summer months, wave energy actually peaks in the winter. So it provides us with that reliable source of power that we need when we need it. In addition to that, wave power is actually the largest unused renewable energy source in the world, and it has the technical feasible resource potential to meet 30% of the US electricity demand, in addition to that of the world. And so living in California again, we have that opportunity to really have this energy and power delivered directly to our front doors. And so CalWave has developed a viable technology for wave energy generation called the xWave, which is what you're seeing here. And what you can picture is really a device that's anchored to the seafloor with overpassing waves, really creating this pressure gradient that causes the device to move and orbit in that water column. And so our generators within the device convert this motion into electricity that's then transported back to land via a subsea cable. And some of the key features that I'd like to point out are our ability to operate fully autonomously and fully submerged, which really enables the highest performance and reliability. And so having autonomous controls really means that our system can lower itself when there are extreme waves and extreme storms for survivability purposes, and it decides this on its own. And our technology has over a 40% capacity factor, which when we have an opportunity to actually co-locate with wind to greatly increase this number. And that involves, sharing infrastructure as well to sort of to actually reduce costs. In addition to that, our system has been designed to last for over 20 years, has been designed for 50-year storms, and additionally has an acceptable environmental impact according to third-party reports, such as the State of Science report. And operations maintenance occurs on the surface, which also helps to lower costs. And then with sort of design elements itself, we've worked with our naval partners to identify anti-biofouling and anti-corrosive paints, which help the device survive for much longer as well. And so that leads me to a really great moment for us that happened last year. In 2020, September of 2020, we actually deployed California's first and our first long duration wave energy project. And so this occurred about 1,600 feet off of the coast of Scripps Institute of Oceanography in La Jolla. And the goal here was to really validate the performance and reliability of our xWave system in open ocean. Some of the big milestones that we hit here were successfully operating at 99.8% uptime over this 10-month period. We saw no issues with recovery or installation. Sorry, I meant to show that video from the start, but I hope you guys enjoy seeing sort of, this is from the very beginning to the very end of our deployment here in San Diego. And in addition to recovery and installation, we were able to prove that our autonomous controls were reliable and robust. The system started operating completely autonomously starting in November 3rd. Power outputs, motions, and loads agreed well with our forecasts and simulations from previous pilots and tank tests and information like that. And we managed to survive 2 rare 10-year storms in San Diego through that autonomous control system. Again, no interventions, and continued to operate safely in all sea states. We also worked and collaborated with Pacific Northwest National Labs to deploy acoustic and visual monitoring equipment around our device to really keep track and collect data about the environmental impacts that we were having. And the findings found that there were no significant impacts to marine life. And that is something that we want to be really cognizant about. So that's, something that was really great for us to hear. And of course, our partners, to give a little shout out to the U.S. Department of Energy, Scripps, and various national labs, and of course, UC Berkeley. And so what we have coming up next, since our pilot in San Diego was really a scaled down version of our X 100 kilowatt system, we're deploying next at CalWave, that 100 kilowatt model. And this will be happening off the coast of Newport, Oregon in 2024. Our goal here is to really scale and validate our X-Wave system for use on local energy grids and microgrids. And this CalWave test site is actually going to be the first federally approved pre-permitted utility grid connected wave energy site in the US, rated at 20 megawatts. And what's exciting as well, earlier in January of this year, we received the US Department of Energy's largest award of $7.5 million out of their latest investment of $25 million to really be able to deploy this project out in Oregon. And we're really excited because this is a huge opportunity for us to really, it's the next big step towards commercialization and being able to get out and test our X100, which is viable for really supporting even remote islands and other coastal areas that are in need. And so now we are on our way to design for CalWave, of course, but also through some of the big things that have happened over this year, such as CEC and others announcing great support for offshore energy. We really are taking this moment to begin some conversations about how we can work together collaboratively to co-locate and really be able to, provide more reliable power and lower costs to support folks living, basically all around the world who have access to the ocean. And then, of course, our whole goal is to eventually be able to provide utility scale power. We're looking at having farms and expanding globally by 2025 onward. Short-term impacts that we see for us is really having the ability to replace fossil fuels for small island developing states that are now really highly dependent on fossil fuels. They're using as much as 90% of that. And these are extremely dirty, highly carbon intensive. And so we really see being able to help them first. And then from there, we also see being able to filling the renewable energy gap by complementing offshore wind with the cleanest source of electricity from our oceans. And so the ocean has one of the lowest carbon life cycle emissions out of all energy sources. And in being able to harness it, we see being able to provide affordable and clean energy. We'll be able to take action for climate, increase the number of local jobs, and then also support sustainable cities and communities and industry and innovation. And so our team is currently hiring. So if you happen to know anyone who is interested in jumping into a career that can help save the planet, please send them our way. It's a really exciting time for us to be growing. And yes, just thank you all so much for tuning in, and really excited for any questions you might have. Happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julie. It's really wonderful to see your pilot projects, the plans for the future, exciting with the growth opportunities with the jobs as well. Thank you everyone for continuing to put questions in the chat. Again, we'll circle back to these at the end if you have any other questions or the speakers would like to elaborate on some details that have been added there. With that, we'll transition over to our last speaker, Rhetta deMesa, who serves as an electric generation system program specialist at the California Energy Commission, where she spent over 10 years working on climate and energy policy. She recently joined the offshore wind energy team, Prior to her work on offshore wind, she served as a special advisor to former Vice Chair Janaea Scott and spent time in the Energy Commission's Research and Development and Transportation divisions. So we're really excited to hear from you as well. Go ahead and share your slides.
Thanks, Kaitlyn. You have my slides, perfect. Good evening, everyone. As Kaitlyn mentioned, I'm Rhetta deMesa with the California Energy Commission, and I work on the offshore wind energy team. Big thanks to the Stay Cool team for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the outlook for offshore wind here in California. You can go to the next slide, please. So just briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with the California Energy Commission, we're the state's primary energy policy and planning agency, where we play a key role in creating and implementing policies and programs that help to create a low carbon economy. Under our umbrella of responsibilities, we have a role in developing and advancing renewable energy technologies such as offshore wind, which we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. So offshore wind is really poised to play an important role in California's clean energy future. California as a state has very aggressive climate and renewable energy goals, and we're working hard to transition ourselves to a low carbon economy. We're working economy-wide to decrease greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and to be net zero by 2045. Additionally, we're working to ensure that at least 90% of all retail sales of electricity come from renewable energy or low carbon sources, such as wind and solar, by 2045. That increases to 95% by 2040 and 100% by 2045. This past July, Governor Newsom urged bold actions to address the urgency of the climate crisis by outlining new targets and actions for California to accelerate progress on our climate goals. He urged us as a state to work with our federal partners to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind, noting that California is home to one of the best offshore wind resources in the world, and that offshore wind can serve as a clean domestic source of electricity that can play an important role in meeting the state's growing need for clean energy. Next slide, please. So why offshore wind? Offshore wind generation provides a significant opportunity to bring a number of benefits to California. If deployed at scale, the development of offshore wind can provide economic and environmental benefits to the state and the nation. Benefits include advancing progress toward the state's renewable energy and climate goals, diversifying energy portfolio and complementing other renewables such as solar for improved grid reliability. And like other renewable generation, offshore wind can also reduce GHG emissions and improve air quality. Finally, offshore wind development presents an opportunity for economic benefits such as job creation, attracting investment capital, and realizing local and community benefits within the state. So there's certainly a lot of benefits that could be realized from building out an offshore wind industry here in California. Next slide, please. I wanted to just briefly touch on offshore wind technology so we all have a common understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about offshore wind, especially what we would be looking at here in California. So offshore wind technologies are not new. They've been deployed in Europe and in Asia and are under active development on the East Coast. But to date, most of the offshore wind that has been deployed uses what's known as fixed bottom foundations, which attach directly to the seafloor and are really more suitable for shallow waters. Here in California, due to the deep waters that we have off our coast, offshore wind deployments would require floating offshore wind technology, which is essentially turbines installed on floating platforms that are then attached to the seabed with mooring lines and anchors. The global floating offshore wind market is much less developed when compared to fixed bottom, but the technology is quickly advancing. So in the diagram on the left here, you can see that we have two turbines that are fixed to the bottom of the seabed. And as you sort of move to the right into the deeper waters, you transition into the different types of floating foundations, which, as I mentioned, is what we would likely be using here in California. And then on the right-hand side, we have a diagram of the elements of what an offshore wind generation facility could look like. You'd likely have several turbines that would be interconnected with array cables. Those would then connect to what would likely be a floating offshore wind substation, which would include an export cable connecting the system back onto shore and into the grid. Next slide, please. So California has been exploring offshore wind for a number of years, In fact, the CEC has been engaged in a range of initiatives to better understand the opportunities for deploying offshore wind for more than a decade. However, the planning for offshore wind in California really accelerated in 2016 when the Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force was launched in partnership with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. BOEM is the federal entity responsible for renewable energy development in federal waters. In coordination with the state, as well as with local and tribal governments, BOEM identified areas that could be the focus of a call for information or nominations. And in 2018, BOEM initiated a call for information and nominations for 3 areas: Humboldt, Morro Bay, and Diablo Canyon. Today, 2 of those areas, Humboldt and Morro Bay, are moving forward with the BOEM process, and BOEM anticipates holding a lease sale for the 2 wind energy areas by the end of the year. Next slide, please. So here we have the 2 wind energy areas that BOEM anticipates holding a lease sale for. The Humboldt wind energy area is off the north coast and has an estimated capacity of 1.6 gigawatts. The Morro Bay wind energy area is off the central coast and has an estimated capacity of 3.1 gigawatts. Combined, these 2 areas could support close to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind. It's important to note, though, that the issuance of any leases that come from a lease sale wouldn't necessarily constitute approval of a project. Rather, it grants the lessee the right to submit site assessment plans and construction and operation plans, which would then go through an environmental, technical, and public review process prior to any decisions being made. Next slide, please. And then building on the state's work to assess offshore wind, last year the legislature passed and Governor Newsom signed Assembly Bill 525, which became effective January 1st of this year. AB 525 tasked the Energy Commission in coordination with several other state agencies to develop a thoughtful and responsible approach for the development and deployment of offshore wind at scale. To do that, AB 525 requires the Energy Commission to develop a strategic plan for offshore wind energy by June of next year. The strategic plan is required to include 5 chapters that address identification of sea space, economic and workforce development, transmission planning, permitting, and potential impacts on coastal resources and ocean users. The legislation also requires some interim work products that will inform the strategic plan. These include establishing offshore wind planning goals, developing a preliminary assessment of the economic benefits as they relate to seaport investments and workforce, and to develop a permitting roadmap. Next slide, please. Our offshore wind team at the Energy Commission has been working on implementation of AB 525 since the beginning of the year, with an early focus on addressing the first interim requirement of the legislation, which was to establish offshore wind planning goals for 2030 and 2045 for the purposes of informing the strategic plan. In August of this year, the CEC adopted a report in which we established planning goals of 2 to 5 gigawatts by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045, which is enough electricity to power up to 25 million homes if you're looking at that upper end of the range there, the 2045 goal. These planning goals are designed to be potentially achievable but aspirational and are established at levels that can contribute significantly to California's climate goals. Our team at the CEC is continuing to work on the remaining requirements of AB 525 and are working towards having that strategic plan in June as required by the legislation. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation. Again, thank you for the opportunity to join you guys tonight, and I look forward to the discussion.
That is phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing about this exciting new technology off of our coast. And I'm sure we're really interested to hear about the upcoming leases and other opportunities as well we can expect. Awesome. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you for those of you who have been adding those. If you would prefer instead to raise your hand and ask your question directly to the speakers, feel free to do that down at the bottom of Zoom. There's something called reactions, and you can click on that and we'll raise your hand virtually. I'll make sure to loop you in there. So I'm going to start off just by going through some of the questions we have in the chat. I know we've been discussing a couple of them, but perhaps we'll give the speakers a little bit more time to elaborate. So we have a question starting off with Stephanie. What was the criteria used for selecting that site in the bay for the econcrete project for Paula.
Yeah, thanks. Would have maybe taken up too much of the chat to put the response in there, but I did see it. So there were lots of different criteria. So one is just like, what's the, 70% of the shorelines within San Diego Bay is armored. So, and they have different type of armoring, right? So riprap was the preferred armoring to replace, right? And it was easier from a permitting perspective to replace that with tide pools rather than other types of, shoreline infrastructure like, piers or wharfs or, concrete walls and things like that. So that was part of it. They also wanted to have a little bit of exposure to some wave energy to make sure that they could be properly assessed from a strength perspective. And then there was also that area at Harbor Island Park is frequently, there's a lot of hotels around that area, and there's a lot of visitor serving services that happen there. So we wanted to have a little bit of visibility with the public being able to see the project.
That does sound really cool to go out and visit that. Thank you for that. We have another question from Judith in the chat. She said, to X-Wave technology, has there been any testing to see how the technology impacts marine life? I know, Dan, you add a little bit of info in the chat, especially with a report from PNNL about any impacts to marine life. Either Julie or Dan, would you like to elaborate on that and share a little bit more about the research going into that report?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, PNNL worked with Integral Consulting along with one other partner who I'm blanking on, but they were able to deploy some visual monitoring, so video cameras around to sort of see how marine life was engaging with our device. And there's some pretty cool shots of really, fish just swimming around it. There were some sea turtles that also came by to really say hello, but it almost seems as if, animals are seeing this sort of as a peer instead of an obstacle. And because there are no fast moving parts, there's no risk of harm in that way. There was also acoustic equipment that was deployed, so to really monitor the sound levels, and those all came out to be, no significant impact there. And so, yeah, because we have just this system that bobs and flows with the waves, there's really not too much risk there that we're seeing so far, but we're definitely going to continue monitoring within our next demonstrations and going forward as well.
If I can follow up on that, is there biofouling that you experience? Is there a team that goes out and gives it a good scrub down every once in a while, or is it pretty protected against that?
Yeah, so there were no, there was some biofouling, but nowhere on parts that prevented or, prevented operations. Really on the flat painted surfaces, there was no biofouling there. So that was promising to show that the paint works. And we made sure to work with partners to make sure that that paint had no followed local regulations as well.
Excellent. We have a couple other questions for CalWave here in the chat. I'll give a couple to you rapid fire. What is the energy output of one of these X-Wave devices? And also, what are some of the key challenges to developing wave energy? Do you see any detractors, or how do you potentially mitigate that?
Yeah, so our X-Wave pilot unit was really a scaled down version of our X100, but we're also looking to scale that up to the X800, which is an 800 kilowatt device. And in terms of any detractors, it's really right now the cost of testing and deployment still remains high, although there are numerous, with the numerous support that we're receiving in terms of investment from government, it's really enabling us to accelerate this process. And then even with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, we've been able to see, investments that will go towards commercialization in the future, such as production tax credits, which will be huge later down the line as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, and if just Dan or Marcus want to add something, definitely jump in as well.
No, I think it was well spoken. That was he took the words I was going to say.
We just got a really nice comment in the chat that I'll share from Jean. She says, "Thank you. I'm 75 years old and listening to the presentations from the youth has given me so much hope for my grandsons and their future and for all the children who'll be given a new and better life." Thank you so much for those kind words. I think that's, really wonderful about bringing together everyone here on these webinars and learning about some of the new technology. We have, I think, a question probably shared between CalWave and Rhetta as well, from Laura, who says, "We see how coastal communities have lost power due to hurricanes. So can CalWave or some of the offshore wind technologies designed to withstand these Category 4 size hurricanes and keep producing power?"
So I know I'll say just quickly, one of the big differentiators with our technology and the other wave energy technologies is that we operate fully submerged, but near surface. And the power in the waves really dissipates with depth from the surface. So one of the functions that we have, and this is why we're looking at a lot of initial pilot or early customers in the South Pacific and in the Caribbean and in those kind of areas, because our system has the ability to just dive to a deeper depth to mitigate those storms or to remove the structural loading from those storms. Now, granted, Category 4 hurricanes are always, it's hard to say definitively how that affects everything. We're currently designing for 50-year storms. So that's all being looked at once you get beyond those envelopes.
Yeah, that's great. I think I'll turn it over to you, Rhetta. It's really neat to learn about turbines that are floating. I had no idea that was possible. So I'm curious to hear from you how they might withstand, some of these extreme events.
Yeah, that's a great question. So they are being designed with extreme weather in mind. And there's a into continuing to advance the technology to make sure that they can sustain within those weather events. But Category 4s are pretty strong, so I'm not sure. And the actual deployment of floating offshore wind around the world is pretty limited right now. So we don't have a lot of experience at this point understanding exactly how durable they are in those stronger weather conditions.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. We have another question, I believe, for CalWave from Linda in the chat. It says, approximately what percentage of the cost in the Oregon project is for connecting the wind energy to the grid?
Question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, question for Dan.
I couldn't give you a number off the top of my head. One of the advantages about the Oregon project is that the U.S. Department of Energy cited that system and got the FERC permits and got all the grid interconnection permits, so that the cable to shore and the grid interconnection hardware is all kind of pre-put in place and funded by the government separately from our project. So we don't see all of those costs. We just have to do all the grid studies and our own kind of short cable to connect in.
Great, thank you. Rhetta, we have another question in the chat for you about concerns about bird strikes with the wind blades. Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, I don't have any data on hand, but it certainly is a consideration as with terrestrial onshore wind. It's part of the screening process that we use to evaluate in the environmental review. Bird impacts are considered in that portion of the projects, but I don't have any data on hand specifically.
Yeah, definitely, probably still emerging as we continue to develop these new technologies and thinking about benefits and potential costs. I want to turn it back to Paula. I'll note we still have about a little less than 10 minutes or so. So if you continue to have questions, pop those in the chat. But Paula, it's clear the port has a really substantial number of exciting projects going on in the Bay. You probably can't pick favorites of what's going on, but I'm curious to hear your perspective of some of the big new opportunities we might see in the next decade, maybe something that you're really excited about personally or something you think the Bay would be a really wonderful place to see a new idea developed.
Yeah, sure. There is too many to choose from. So, but and we don't know what new technology is going to be out there, right? So that's also really exciting. A lot of the projects, the program is just sort of developed organically, where the projects are helping us solve, unique port environmental challenges, but also informing like potential new opportunities. So I'll just single out aquaculture because it's obviously an important opportunity for many different reasons, from a food security standpoint, but also, the climate benefits of producing shellfish and seaweed are, just becoming more and more clear. So one of the pieces of the program has just been a lot of planning and pre-development work to look at where we might be able to do shellfish and seaweed aquaculture at scale in and around our port jurisdiction, and in a way that doesn't like have any conflicts with major use conflict with existing uses, but also somehow complements, sort of, environmental and economic opportunities to grow in our area, providing jobs and environmental benefit and so on. So that planning effort, is about to get underway. So I would say, and that's long, right? So it's not maybe as long as wind energy development or some of these other things, but there's a thoughtful, detailed planning process that evaluates impacts on all kinds of things. So we're looking forward to going through that process, and maybe at the end of it, providing a more enabling environment for shellfish and seaweed aquaculture companies to come and do their work. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
That would be so cool, to walk along to Seaport Village and see, the local opportunities that we have to take advantage of some of the delicious seafood that we have. Think
Yeah.
about those co-growth opportunities. I think Linda had a question in the chat that was really related to this. You perfectly touched on it. She was asking about whether the kelp project is going to take hold, which is a great pun, Linda, in San Diego.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about that, or?
No, just, that's what our program is trying to do, right? We're testing pilots, the aquaculture pilots specifically, well, almost all of them are, they're pilots, right? So they've been successful and they're ready to scale. So, but to create that more enabling environment to allow projects like that to scale is sort of the next part of our planning processes at the port. So we're looking forward to, bigger firms than tiny little pilots.
We'd love to have you back, I think, in a couple of years to hear more
Sure.
about that and how it's grown. I have a question for both Julie and Rhetta. These ocean solutions are really exciting to complement against some of the renewable energy that we see in the terrestrial environment here on land. Here at Stay Cool, we've talked about solar panels, things like that, and that's something that as citizens can show support for by putting on our roofs. But I'm curious how citizens can show support for continuing to develop these larger scale avenues of renewable power out in the ocean. Do you have some perspective on opportunities there?
I guess I'll go ahead and start. I think just continuing to stay informed and engaged on these different types of technologies, the opportunities and challenges around them, and having a sense of what they may or may not mean for your community is really important. Also creating those opportunities to educate and inform within your communities, which I know you guys do a lot of work on, especially working with your young folks, making sure that they are aware of what's going on when it's coming to these emerging technologies. I mentioned we established our planning goals back in August, and we had a business meeting where they were presented, and we had a number of young college students who came and spoke at it, and it really resonated and impressed a number of our commissioners. They talked about how exciting it was to see that youth brought into our process. And so I would just say continuing to stay engaged and involved and educated.
Absolutely. I feel like echoing Rhetta's sentiment there. We all have so much agency as individuals to really, advocate for the things that we care about. So when that comes to the ocean, when it comes to the planet, we can always talk about it. Even let's say you're going to the beach with your family and friends, point to the ocean, just be like, isn't it crazy how powerful that is? And then just start the conversation from there. And that's just at the personal level, but even going higher up, thinking about policies that we can support and things that we can do. We can always write letters to our representatives. Right now, the National Hydropower Association, which we're a part of, we're standing behind, this coalition effort to really ask for more funding to support the Water Power Technologies Office and the programs there. And so each of us on our team are also writing letters and getting in contact with our policymakers. And that's something, everyone here can also do. And we'd be happy to sort of help guide you on that process as well. If anyone's interested, feel free to reach out to me.
Oh, thank you. Those are both really inspiring answers. I appreciate that. We have 2 last questions. So in our last couple of minutes, we'll do a really quick rapid fire. They're more, I think, on the technical side. From Laura, she's asking about where are the turbines for the offshore wind manufactured and what kind of port infrastructure is required on land to erect and launch the turbines.
Yeah, I think where they're going to be manufactured is still being determined, but ideally we want to build a local manufacturing and supply chain in California and draw as much of that economic benefit to us as we can. So we're kind of thinking about the best ways of going about doing that in our planning process. And then in terms of the port infrastructure, that's an interesting question. We're doing a lot of work on assessing our existing ports and determining, what kind of capabilities and infrastructure they have that can support offshore wind and kind of what those gaps are. Our current ports, as is, are not capable of supporting these turbines. They're so large, it's going to take a lot of investment and improvement, and we're trying to figure out kind of where the best places to do that and how to make that happen is.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Our last question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I know. I was just going to very quickly say too. That's one of the things I know we at Cali have been keeping a close eye on, because I know like the types of port infrastructure and civil infrastructure that will be needed for offshore wind, will be kind of very well suited for the things that we'll need in the future too. So it's nice to be able to kind of join forces in the aspects of kind of meeting those needs.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'll note there's one last question in the chat. I think, Dan, you covered it beautifully, so take a look at that if anyone's interested. I'll go ahead and thank our speakers incredibly much for joining us here today and sharing their expertise, continuing to stay on and answer all of our questions as we learn more about these new exciting opportunities here in California. I'll wrap up by saying that if you aren't yet a member of Stay Cool, you can head over to our website here on the screen, Stay Cool number 4, grandkids.org. So members receive the Cool News newsletter, which is excellent. It has a lot of local information and other news to stay abreast of, invitations to upcoming events and action alerts. So you'll soon be able to rewatch this webinar on our YouTube channel, and stay tuned for future webinars as well as our book club that's coming up. Our next meeting is on October 25th, and we're currently reading Blowout by Rachel Maddow. So again, thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. Thank you again to our speakers, and we look forward to seeing you at the next meeting.
Thank you, everyone.